Good afternoon and welcome. Today's celebration of justice and equity, a historic marker unveiling here in Leonardtown. Benjamin Hance, St. Mary's County's only documented lynching victim. And he was first held right here in a cell on this site. The story will be told today through poetry, song, readings, and a keynote address from Dr. Tawanda Jordan, president of the St. Mary's College of Maryland. The Department of Recreation and Parks and the Museum Division, we join with the Equal Justice Initiative to share this story with each of you. We're delighted you could be here. And before we get started in the program, there are some special guests I'd like to recognize, and then we'll move forward and leave, seeing as this is a day of joy and a day of change. Our Board of County Commissioners present today, President Randy Guy, Commissioner Eric Colvin, and Commissioner Todd Morgan. Part of our program today, but also our Sheriff Tim Cameron. The Clerk of the Circuit Court, Deborah Birch. The Register of Wills, Phyllis Superior. State Delegate Brian Crosby. There's many of our Museum Board of Trustees here, and I'm delighted that they could be here as well. Ladies and gentlemen, you have a strong program today. You'll meet many more, and you'll be thrilled with the sounds and the story being told. Thank you for coming, and I want to say this now as I turn it over to our museum manager, Karen Stone. She's been at the forefront of this story for the last 2 years. The Emancipation Day of Maryland, November 1, 2019, as we had the soil taken up there. Karen, the department's proud of you, and we're proud of the day you've brought before us. Now you come lead us through the rest of our program. Thank you.
I have my brick to keep my papers in place today. It was exactly 2 years ago today that we completed the first leg of this journey at the soil collection ceremony over at the Port of Leonardtown Park. Done in conjunction with the Equal Justice Initiative, we filled 2 jars of soil and became part of the lynching memorial in Alabama. The second jar is here in the cell once occupied by Benjamin Hance. Today we complete the second part of the journey with the erection of the historic marker. All throughout this journey, we have told and retold Mr. Hance's story. It does not get any easier to tell or to hear it, and it is not a story to be proud of. But we are proud of events like this. By telling this story again and again and having it up on this marker for all to see, we hope that our community will continue to reflect on the past, present, and future to ensure that every single person is afforded an equal opportunity to thrive in life. We have come a long way since June 17, 1887, but our journey doesn't end here. I don't know exactly where the next leg will take us, but I do know that with our work here, we are helping to move us all closer to a just society. Now please stand as you are able for the scripture reading and prayer by Father Beaubien of St. Aloysius Church.
I think you'll realize why I chose this passage from the Passion narrative of the Holy Gospel according to St. Luke. Jesus went, as was his custom, to the Mount of Olives, and the disciples followed him. When he arrived at the place, he said to them, "Pray that you may not undergo the test." After withdrawing about a stone's throw from them and kneeling, he prayed, saying, "Father, if you are willing, take this cup away from me. Still, not my will, but yours be done." And to strengthen him, an angel from heaven appeared to him. He was in such agony, and he prayed so fervently that his sweat became like drops of blood falling on the ground. When he rose from prayer and returned to his disciples, he found them sleeping from grief. He said to them, "Why are you sleeping? Get up and pray that you may not undergo the test." While he was still speaking, a crowd approached, and in front was one of the 12, a man named Judas. He went up to Jesus to kiss him. Jesus said to him, "Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss?" His disciples realized what was about to happen, and they asked, "Lord, shall we strike with a sword?" And one of them struck the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. But Jesus said in reply, "Stop, no more of this." Then he touched the servant's ear and healed him. And Jesus said to the chief priests and the temple guards and elders who had come for him, "Have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs? Day after day I was with you in the temple area, and you did not seize me. But this is your hour, the time for the power of darkness." After arresting him, they led him away and took him into the house of the high priest. Peter was following at a distance. They lit a fire in the middle of the courtyard and sat around it, and Peter sat down with them. When a maid saw him seated in the light, she looked intently at him and said, "This man too was with him." But he denied it, saying, "Woman, I do not know him." A short while later, someone else saw him and said, "You too are one of them." But Peter answered, "My friend, I am not." About an hour later, still another insisted, "Assuredly, this man too was with him, for he also is a Galilean." But Peter said, "My friend, I do not know what you are talking about." Just as he was saying this, the cock crowed, and the Lord turned and looked at Peter, and Peter remembered the word of the Lord, how he had said to him, "Before the cock crows today, you will deny me 3 times." He went out and began to weep bitterly. The men who held Jesus in custody were ridiculing and beating him. Let us pray. Lord our God, the unjust apprehension of Benjamin Hance from the Leonardtown jail makes us recall the mob that took the Son of Man from the Garden of Gethsemane to his eventual death on the cross. Those with faith knew that Jesus was an innocent man. On this day of All Saints, November 1st, none of us can claim innocence before God or man. Yet, everyone deserves his day in court before an impartial judge and a jury of their peers. All deserve the due process of justice to render a fair verdict regarding guilt, and so where there is a will to repent and reform, a measure of mercy may be extended. To God's mercy, we commend Benjamin and ourselves as we pray, Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen.
Please be seated. Along this journey, we have partnered with the Maryland Lynching Memorial Project and are involved in a number of initiatives with them, including oral histories, public forums, and celebrations like this one. I'm very pleased to have the president of that organization with us today. Please welcome Mr. Will Schwartz.
Thank you so much. I often describe myself as an accidental activist. I had absolutely no plan for my life to turn out this way a few years ago when this all started, but I think it's a barometer of how important this reckoning is, that it has gained so much momentum thanks to Karen and groups like the St. Mary's Coalition, as well as coalitions. We have coalitions in 12 or 13 of the 17 counties where we know racial terror lynchings occurred in Maryland. So first of all, thank you so much for having me. I'm honored beyond description to be here with you to celebrate this day. We've become, we've lost our attention span over the years. I think it's certainly over my lifetime. I've noticed that we've become, our public attention span has gotten shorter and smaller and has shrunk considerably. In my own house, we watch news a lot. My wife likes to turn to me and say, you digest it for me and drop it in my beak. I don't want to go through that. So that's kind of an indication. I remember actually listening to Brian Stevenson several years ago, and he talked about how the way we understand history, it's like the civil rights movement happened over a weekend, right? There was slavery, Lincoln freed the slaves, Rosa Parks didn't give up her seat, we passed the Civil Rights Act, and we're good, it's over. So, I think it just indicates that we've become kind of like a 140 character culture. And we understand history, like a Jeopardy question. So, the answer is November 1st, 1864. Well, the question is, when did Maryland abolish slavery? And it surprises a lot of people who assumed that all the slaves were freed by the Emancipation Proclamation. But the Emancipation Proclamation, which was became effective on January 1st of 1863, it freed all the slaves except it was not in Maryland. It only applied to the Confederate States. And Maryland, however tenuously, remained in the Union. Someone at the archives likes to put it that Lincoln freed the slaves over which he had no control, which is another, and he did it, it was a way of keeping states like Maryland in the Union, frankly. But the import of that decision also was that it changed the goal of the war from one of unification to the abolishment of slavery. And even in Maryland's situation, it was a bit more complicated. Maryland has had 3 constitutions in the course of our statehood. The second constitution that Maryland wrote and ratified in 1851 actually prohibited any law abolishing the relation of master or slave as it now exists in the state. So slavery was enshrined. It wasn't just tolerated. It was protected. It was legally protected. And there was obviously, as we got closer to the Civil War, there was a movement to abolish slavery, but it wasn't unique to the United States. It was rather advanced elsewhere in the world. It had been abolished. Slavery was abolished in France in 1794. In 1807, England abolished the slave trade, and in 1833, slavery itself was banned. So once the war started, in 1862, that year, Congress actually freed the slaves in Washington, D.C. But that same year, Maryland ratified what they called the Shadow 13th Amendment. And what it did was it barred the federal government from abolishing slavery. This is in 1862. So that meant that, we had it in the Constitution, and then here was another ratification of that. That meant that abolishing slavery in the Free State, which is what we call ourselves, required a new constitution. And in 1864, the governor at the time, Augustus Bradford, he called on the General Assembly to convene a third constitutional convention, which it did. And the convention was convened in Annapolis at the end of April of 1864, which was just a few weeks after the 13th Amendment had been passed in the House of Representatives. It adjourned, the Constitutional Convention that is, adjourned in September, and it included a provision that did abolish slavery in the state, but it still needed to be ratified by the electorate in a referendum, and that was no sure thing. In fact, the referendum was held in the state in October 12 and 13 of that year. But as you recall, there was a war going on. There was still a war going on. So the referendum included a mechanism that allowed soldiers in the field, on the battlefield, to vote. It was absentee voting, right? Which we've come to love or not lately around here. Really not unlike our recent history, it was probably because of the absentee voting that the referendum was approved. The final tally was 30,174 in favor, 29,799 against. So the margin by which that Constitution was ratified and slavery abolished in the state of Maryland was 375 votes. So Governor Bradford certified the results on October 29th. This was the third state constitution, which indeed did abolish slavery, and it went into effect November 1st, 1864, 157 years ago to the day, this day. Now, just to tie up some loose ends, the 13th Amendment passed the House in the following January, and it was ratified and went into effect in December of 1865. And also remember, it's important to remember also that the Confederate states were required to pass it before they were allowed to regain their representation by the federal government. So I think it's, this is it wasn't, a switch wasn't flipped and the slaves were freed in Maryland. It didn't happen that way. And I think it's important to remember this difficult path today, even as we commemorate the awful murder of Benjamin Hance. Reckoning is not easy. Justice is not easy. The Maryland Lynching Memorial Project, one of our goals is to acknowledge publicly the racial terror lynchings that occurred in our state, as we are going to be doing today. But as we do, I think it's really critical to acknowledge that this in itself is not the achievement, right? It's a promise more than an achievement. It's a promise to continue to work for justice, to continue the conversations around racism in this country, and to continue to dedicate ourselves to dismantling the machinery of white supremacy. And we've got a lot of work to do, but this is a great start. Thank you so much.
Benjamin Hance, a 22-year-old African-American man, was lynched by a mob of several white men in the early morning of June 17, 1887, in Leonardtown, Maryland. Mr. Hance was taken into custody and was awaiting trial in the building right behind us. At approximately 2 o'clock in the morning, the mob broke down the jail door and seized Mr. Hance. Mr. Hance was born in St. Mary's County near the end of the Civil War and later came to Leonardtown. During the 1870s, he worked here, first in the service of oysterman Henry Mattingly, and by 1887 was working on the oyster vessel of Captain Frank Russell. In May of 1887, while running an errand for Captain Russell, Mr. Hance allegedly encountered a white woman named Alice Bailey, daughter of Shercliffe Bailey, a local farmer. Miss Bailey later claimed that Mr. Hance made an improper proposal to her and attempted to attack her in the vicinity of John V. Camelier's gate. Mr. Hance was apprehended by Constable C. Hayden Russell and others and was brought before Justice John C. Hurry before being committed to jail on May 27th. Although a verdict concerning the accusations against Mr. Hance had not yet been rendered in a court of law, the allegation alone was enough to incite the hostility of white residents as threats of lynching Mr. Hance began spreading throughout the town. Around 1:30 a.m. on June 17th, 3 weeks after Mr. Hance was put in jail, a group of local white men arrived on horseback and woke the jailer, Mr. C. John Clements, by banging on the door. During his testimony before the coroner's jury, Clements said the mob claimed to have a prisoner for him by the name of Johnny Johnson. But after Clements expressed doubts about the claim, the mob indicated they had come for Benjamin Hance. The mob ordered Clements to give up the keys, but he refused, so the mob proceeded to break down the door with axes. One member of the mob held the jailer at gunpoint, while the others went upstairs to the cells. Clements further testified that it took the mob 30 to 40 minutes to successfully break into Hance's cell. The mob seized Mr. Hance, whom Clements recalled went along quietly. The mob took Mr. Hance first to a locust tree in the courthouse yard to be hanged. Dr. John T. Spaulding objected to the lynching happening near his home, saying that it would disturb his pregnant wife. So the mob tied Mr. Hance up, placed him on horseback, and proceeded out of town towards the area near the gate that led into the farm of the late John F. Wathen on the road to Newtown Neck. It was here that the mob hanged Benjamin Hance from the branch of a witch hazel tree, which was directly over the public road to the Newtown Church. The Baltimore Sun reported that in the midst of his last words and prayers, Mr. Hance requested, "Send word to my friends to take charge of my body and bury it in Sacred Heart Graveyard." In spite of this request, the Sun went on to report that Dr. Coombs ordered that Mr. Hance be buried in his home parish of St. Aloysius in Leonardtown, which was done. The morning after Mr. Hance's lynching, a coroner's jury was convened, Dr. Charles Combs presiding. The Baltimore Sun gave this description of the coroner's findings. There was considerable blood on the front of the clothing and upon the right hand. He was pinioned from the elbows around the back by a small rope. He had no shoes on and no coat or vest. There were a number of the tracks of horses north and south of the spot, and the track of a light wheel buggy or wagon under where the body hung, from which it was inferred he was dropped after being lashed to the tree above. The rope was half an inch thick, and a properly formed hangman's knot was placed around his neck. Small cords were about his legs, loosely tied. The presumption was that Hance came to his death from strangulation. Though the coroner's jury was meant to help identify members of the mob, the convening was largely a farce. At least one juror refused to name a man whom he knew had participated in the lynching, while another juror proclaimed that he fully justified the lynching and would have been willing at any time to take part in it. Despite the juror's expressed approval of the lynching, he was still asked to serve in the investigation. Though Jailer Clements and his wife offered the names of several men whom they identified as members of the mob, including Alice Bailey's father, Shercliffe Bailey, the coroner's jury ultimately rendered no verdict and declined to ask the state to charge anyone for the lynching of Mr. Hance. When Governor Hogan issued the pardon for all 34 lynching victims in Maryland earlier this year, the first person I wanted to talk to about this was the county attorney, Mr. David Weiskopf. I wondered how you can pardon someone who has not been convicted. He had never stood trial for the crime he was accused of committing. And David has kindly agreed to share those thoughts with you today and explain to you what he explained to me.
The long journey of restoring dignity to a man unjustly slain that culminates here today started earlier this year when the Maryland Lynching Memorial Project and middle school students in Towson petitioned the governor to issue a posthumous pardon for Howard Cooper, a 15-year-old child lynching victim in Baltimore County. After receiving their petition, Governor Hogan directed his legal counsel to review all known accounts of racial lynching in Maryland. As a result of that review, he issued pardons for 34 individuals for racial terror lynchings between the years 1854 and 1933. His pardon absolved from any guilt of their alleged offenses and exempted from them any pains and penalties imposed upon them. Benjamin Hance was one of the recipients of the governor's pardon. A pardon is defined as the act of officially nullifying punishment or other legal consequences of a crime. The origins of pardoning in the United States can be found way back in English history, probably going back to the 1300s, where back then it was a right of the king to pardon for a breach of the king's peace and to show mercy. And the practice of formal pardons entered into Anglo-Saxon law, probably, with codes of William the Conqueror and also the Magna Carta. And I think it's very important to discuss what was also granted in the Magna Carta that day in June of 1215 are the other famous and enduring rights that bring us here today, most specifically what they call chapters 39 and chapters 40. And I'll read them, they're very short. Chapter 39 is, no free man shall be seized, imprisoned, dispossessed, outlawed, exiled, or ruined in any way, nor in any way proceeded against, except by the lawful judgment of his peers and the law of the land. And chapter 40 is, to no one will we sell, to no one will we deny or delay right or justice. And the right to pardon is found in the United States and Maryland Constitution and is the executive's extraordinary means to better administer justice, or as in what brings us here today, to right an extraordinary wrong. Our American system of justice is supposed to be fair and equal, no matter who you are or what you look like. We must acknowledge that although we had laws in place that said those things, the law was applied unfairly and unequally to many of our citizens. The execution of Benjamin Hance is one such instance. The governor's pardon acknowledges that these rights did not extend to all persons at all times and that we fell short of our ideals, that it took almost 100 years from the 14th Amendment grant of equal protection under the law to Brown versus Board of Education in 1954 is testament to this. And although this is a posthumous pardon, it is never too late to right an injustice, and acknowledging it late is better than continued silence. This pardon acknowledges a miscarriage of justice, and it serves as a beacon warning what can happen when we ignore justice and fairness. And I'd like to end my brief remarks, if I may, on what this means to me. When encountering injustices like this, I am reminded of a lesser-known commandment that says, thou shalt not stand in thy neighbor's blood. And maybe it's the vivid scene conjured up by that directive that's always stuck with me, but I've always taken it to mean that you cannot sit idly by and watch an injustice, that we all have an ethical and moral obligation to stand up and speak out on injustices, and to be silent is to be complicit. That is what I would say to the living here today. And to the shade of Benjamin Hance, I would say we are sorry for the justice denied at his death and for delayed justice in coming to this moment today after so many years. Thank you.
Now, we are going to have a brief musical interlude. The orchestra from St. Mary's Riken is going to perform first, and then behind us, so we're going to ask all of you standing to shift one way or the other, there will be a dance presentation by the St. Mary's Riken dance team. And the music is Amazing Grace and Rescue by Lauren Daigle.
You are not hidden. There's never been a moment you were forgotten. You are not hopeless. You have been broken, your innocence stolen. I hear you whisper underneath your breath. I hear your SOS, your SOS. I will send out an army to find fears relieved. How precious is that grace appeared. The hour I first believed. My chains are gone. I've been set free. My God, my Savior has ransomed me. And like a flood, His mercy reigns. Unending love, amazing grace.
Thank you all so very much. That was a beautiful presentations. I'm asking Janice Walthour to join me up here now as we present the first St. Mary's County Just Society Scholarship Awards. This year's St. Mary's County Just Society Scholarship for high school students. Invited students currently enrolled in a St. Mary's County public, private, or homeschool high school program to create an original work that focuses on a just society as a community remembrance of the lynching of Benjamin Hance. The categories were language arts, fine arts, and performance arts. All of the submitted works are amazing, and each participant should be proud of the pieces that they created. And I hope you will all take a minute afterwards to come into the jail to see all of them. And I would like to thank the volunteer judges for their time and efforts participating in this scholarship, along with the others on the planning team who developed the criteria, publicized it, and set up the portal for submissions. Also, a huge thank you to the sponsors who so freely contributed the funding for the award. This truly was a group effort by a variety of cooperating individuals and organizations. The overall winner today will receive $500. The two second place winners will each receive $250. And we encourage them to use these funds to further their artistic pursuits, be that in the language arts, the fine arts, or the performing arts. Our two second place winners today are Arden McLaren and Caitlin Fries, both students at St. Mary's Riken High School here in Leonardtown. Arden's clay figures are taking action, and it is loving action. They seem to represent Hance's human community, so they are an extension of the victim himself. The focus is not on the perpetrators. The acting figures are gray, not brown, so they may be meant to be purposefully ambiguous as to racial identity, suggesting they could be anyone, even a remorseful perpetrator who wishes to undo the deed. At the same time, it does not gloss over the sadness and irrevocability of the deed. It is very interesting in concept and design. It allows ambiguity but seems to reflect thoughtful decisions and emotional involvement. The artist had a vision and was able to realize it. Caitlin's mixed media collage is clear in concept, visually effective, and skillfully done. The thematic motif of eyes is powerful, and it suggests a somewhat diverse community of eyes through the skillful use of color. It makes the viewer wonder who saw what and how they felt about what they saw. The central noose with its crying eyes is especially powerful. The words painted on the frame, "No justice, no verdict," fits with the suggestion that many eyes saw the crime, yet the perpetrators are hidden and justice is denied. The overall winner today submitted a piece that crossed category lines as both language arts and performance arts. Toma Cheyenne has written a very complex and moving set of lyrics with an original and poetic use of language. Titled Tainted Grounds, the song tells Benjamin Hance's story, as well as many untold stories of injustice, not just in Maryland, but in America. The use of the cello and violin to create the mood for this piece is excellent, as is the overall musical concept. The emotional approach is wonderful, and the lyrics are highly original and full of intellectual heft. Toma is a student at Leonardtown High School. Please join me in congratulating these three winners, and if any of you are here today, would you please come forward at this time? There you are. Okay. It's always difficult to pick a keynote speaker, but in this case the choice was obvious. Dr. Jordan became the 7th president of St. Mary's College of Maryland in 2017. Since joining the college, President Jordan has been widely recognized for her contributions to higher education and the larger community. She has a strong sense of place and history, and the college's recent installation, commemorative to enslaved peoples of Southern Maryland, is stunning, and its unveiling is a moment she can be proud of. Please welcome Dr. Jordan.
Good evening, afternoon. Talk to me, people. It's cold.
Yeah, we're all cold.
We're all
Good
cold.
afternoon.
You know, having to give these kinds of talks are incredibly difficult, especially when you're standing at the site where the crime was made, right? And plus, I'm standing here with a cannon to my back. That doesn't make me feel good at all. But those of you who've heard me speak before, you know that I'm going to be a little bit direct and honest in my telling of what it is I have to say. And it is what it is. And I want to thank Karen. She does such an awesome job for all that you're doing for our community. It is just amazingly wonderful and necessary. I'm also appreciative of the brick. Because this wind, it is. All right. Southern trees bear a strange fruit. Blood on the leaves and blood at the root. Black bodies swinging in the southern breeze. Strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees. Pastoral scene of the gallant South, the bulging eyes and the twisted mouth. Scent of magnolia, sweet and fresh, and the sudden smell of burning flesh. Here is the fruit for the crows to pluck, for the rain to gather, for the wind to suck, for the sun to rot, for a tree to drop. Here is a strange fruit and bitter crop. I've just read the lyrics of Strange Fruit. The imagery is so vivid. Those of us who are old enough can hear Billie Holiday's melancholy voice speak to the horrors of this strange fruit. And horror indeed. Benjamin Hance came to be one of these strange fruits, one among more than 6,500 African American men, women, and children. All of us gathered here just heard his story presented by Karen a few minutes ago, but I want to revisit it as it represents an oft-repeated pattern of racial lynching in these United States. The narrative that I am about to present in condensed form is taken directly from the Maryland State Archives website, there for all of you to read and put to memory. And I quote, Benjamin Hance, an African-American man, was lynched June 17, 1887, in Leonardtown for allegedly attempting to assault a white woman named Alice Bailey while she was walking along a road towards Stone's Wharf. Hance asked her for directions to a landing, reportedly made several indecent proposals. She ran, he caught up, and allegedly threw her to the ground, end quote. Obviously, he must have had a moment of temporary insanity, since before long he realized that her, and I quote, cries and fits of resistance would bring attention to the assault. I'm just going to pause right now and tell you that by the time I'd gotten to this point in the narrative, I had rolled my eyes and shaken my head many times. What kind of respectable white woman would be walking a road alone in 19th century Southern America? What black man with half a mind in the 19th century would publicly make, and I quote, indecent proposals to a white woman, run her down, and only stop when he thought people would hear her cries? And where were the witnesses? To say that this is an incredulous story is an understatement, and was and is the plight of many black folk in America. Anyway, back to the narrative. Hance was arrested and taken to jail to await his trial. In the middle of the night, a party of men broke into the jail, overtook the guard, removed Hance, and hung him from a tree on the outskirts of town. Now, they couldn't use the locust tree near the jail because it was in front of the house of the good doctor who protested, not the hanging, but that hanging Hance in front of his home would, and I quote, further injure his sick wife who was resting inside, end quote. Good white man protecting the delicate state and dignity of his woman. What about the dignity of the man, the life of the man who was not afforded due process? We hold as my grandmother would say, bless his heart. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. As the Equal Justice Initiative has pointed out, and I quote, the lynchings of African Americans was terrorism, a widely supported phenomenon used to enforce social subordination and segregation. Lynchings were violent and public events that traumatized black people throughout the country and were largely tolerated by state and federal officials, end quote. Why would state and federal officials tolerate such barbarity and oppression? Another example of man's inhumanity to man. As I grow older and more contemplative, I'm spending a lot more time thinking about the founding of this republic, the birth of our democracy. As I stated a month or so ago at a historic St. Mary's City event related to the discovery of the site of the Fort of St. Mary's, the founding fathers of this democracy were true visionaries. Nonetheless, they were benefiting from the spoils taken from others, and they were looking to enhance and protect their way of life. They were not focused on benevolence or humanitarianism. and humanitarianism. At least that's my view of those early documents upon which this nation is built. Mind you, I could be wrong, since I'm a scholar of neither American history nor the Constitution. My conclusions are based, one, on my lived experience as a Black woman in America, and two, my decades-long quest for truth and understanding. As a biochemist, I look for patterns. The birth of this democracy that included the marginalization and oppression of many for the benefits of the few is a pattern observed since the beginning of humankind. How does one break this pattern? Enlighten, educate, and empower. Earlier this year, Governor Larry Hogan, as you heard, gave a posthumous pardon to 34 victims of racial lynchings in the state of Maryland. Benjamin Hands was included in that pardon. We know that there were more than 34 victims of this heinous act, but the governor followed the rules of the law that define the criteria that can be used to grant a pardon, and only 34 of the victims qualified for that pardon. There are some who criticize the governor for this act. They called it political posturing and stated emphatically that if the governor wanted to do right by the people, he should use the power of his office to change the systems that led to oppression, disenfranchisement, inequities, and inequalities. There may be some truth to the criticism, but I am inclined to say that the system upon which this nation was built, the system of racism, is fully integrated into our daily lives and is extremely complex, thus its enduring nature. Recall, there are 4 levels of racism. Individual racism begets social or intercultural racism, which begets institutional racism, which finally begets structural racism, the foundation of individual racism. Consequently, fixing the system is not as simple as we want and need it to be. I am one of those who believes that the public pardon was and is a path to healing and reconciliation. The same holds true for the public art, or our commemorative to the enslaved peoples of Southern Maryland, located at St. Mary's College of Maryland, as well as the sustained and collaborative work of all associated with historic Sodderly Plantation and other initiatives here in Maryland and across the country that serve to lend voice to those who have been silenced and or disenfranchised. These endeavors force us as a nation to have, as the Equal Justice Initiative counsels, and I quote, honest conversations if we want to move towards healing, end quote. Historical markers illuminating the atrocities of our past are essential in our efforts to mitigate, if not prevent, the repeated patterns of terror, oppression, and marginalization. Enlightenment puts us on the path to prevention. I find that I revisit the idealism represented in the preamble to the Declaration of Independence quite often. The words are inspiring. I wish that they were the reality rather than aspirational idealism, especially during those most challenging times, periods of widespread, in-your-face societal injustices. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. also recalled the words from this quintessential document as he dreamed of a time when America would live up to its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. We believe in the concept of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but the road to those ideals has been challenging, to say the least. Bacon's rebellion in 1675 Virginia put us on the path of oppression via enslavement, Jim Crowism, gentrification, and on, to empower a select few. The patterns of oppression are cyclical, where after a point, the oppressed and their allies get tired. And as Dr. King said, masses of people rise up, and the message is, we want to be free. With Malcolm being steadfast in telling us, by any means necessary. By what means will it take for this country to reconcile with its past and to live up to its potential? Enlighten, educate, and empower. The country is inching ever towards the ideal of life, liberty, and justice for all. But without a shadow of a doubt, we are not there yet. Every time the masses of people rise up, entropy or disruption is introduced into the system, and although there is backlash from those who fight to have things return to the ground state, it never does, and a new equilibrium gets established, an alternate state that gets us closer to the ideal of becoming a more perfect union, and we get a better understanding of the concept of American democracy. The tagline from the Washington Post is, "Democracy dies in darkness." Well, truth lives in the light, is what I would say. And we are firmly in what I call the age of the awakening. As I sat at my desk thinking about this period of awakening, I experienced a sense of hope for our future, because history shows us that from a period of illumination springs forth revolution and change. In my research for today's presentation, I rediscovered such an era that I believe aptly describes where we are today. There was a period known as the Age of Reason, or simply Enlightenment. Here is what I found out about this period, and I quote, "European politics, philosophy, science, and communications were radically reoriented during the course of the long 18th century. That was between 1685 and 1815. As part of a movement referred to as simply the Enlightenment. Enlightenment thinkers questioned traditional authority and enhanced the notion that humanity could be improved through rational change." End quote. Let me say that again. Humanity could be improved through rational change. How do we get to rational change? We educate. The description of the Enlightenment continues, and I quote, "The Enlightenment produced, among other things, laws and revolution." It goes on to say, "The American Revolution was directly inspired by Enlightenment ideals, and Thomas Jefferson is referred to by some as one of the enlightened, a revolutionary whose Declaration of Independence in 1776 framed the American Revolution." In this age of the awakening, or Enlightenment Take Two, are we about to embark on something akin to a revolution? In a 21st century kind of way? Yes, we are. This revolution will not be fought with guns, but almost instantaneously via social media and videos, and more traditionally with collaboratives, commemoratives, markers, and truth tellers, providing illumination and lending voice to the silenced and the oppressed. The masses of people are rising up. The history of this nation is being enriched. And as a result of the more truthful telling of the ways of this American democracy, the enlightened, educated, and empowered people are saying, we are better than this. We hold these truths to be self-evident, and it is time for us to live up to the fundamental beliefs upon which this nation is founded. Benjamin Hance and thousands of others were murdered without due process just for being Black in America. Let us be their purveyors of truth and justice. Every act to memorialize the atrocities of our history serves to enlighten, educate, empower we the people, and prevent history from repeating itself. Every act to honestly and truthfully tell the history of our nation and uplift the oppressed propels this country one step closer to living up to its creed. I will close with a few lines from the musical The Color Purple. And I quote, "Now my eyes are open. Look what God has done. It takes a grain of love to make a mighty tree. Even the smallest voice can make a harmony. Like a drop of water keeps the river high. There are miracles for you and I. Every voice, every monument, every marker counts. Let us go forth and do." Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Jordan. After working together on this project for over 2 years, Gabrielle Daniels and I are finally able to meet in person today. And we are so grateful for the support we've received from the Equal Justice Initiative in getting to this place. It was the Equal Justice Initiative that helped us write the text for the marker, and then they fabricated it and shipped it to us all free of charge. So please join me in both thanking and welcoming Ms. Gabrielle Daniels.
Hello, it's such a pleasure to be here with you today, along with my colleague, Michaela Clark. We have traveled from Montgomery, Alabama to the slightly colder area of Maryland where we gather today. And we are truly grateful to be here to celebrate a momentous occasion in terms of remembering the history and the story, but also the life of Benjamin Hance. At the Equal Justice Initiative, for those of you who may not be as familiar with our organization, we began as a legal nonprofit serving those who were often disenfranchised but were condemned, and also were often the impoverished of our communities. And we're ending up in situations where they did not have appropriate legal representation. They were forgotten very often. And the way in which our system was functioning in the state of Alabama meant that if someone was not willing to do the uncomfortable work of serving those that others had left behind, they would not be served. And for those who we were representing, it meant that they would be executed because we were serving those on Alabama's death row. And what we found in that work and in the compassion that it took to do that work was that it was necessary not only to serve in the courtrooms, but to begin conversations with communities and to tell the stories of those who are representing. That they weren't just statistics, that they weren't just the allegations against them, that they even weren't just the sentence against them, but that they were people. They were people with histories and with families, with communities, with lives, that they were actually more than the things that they were accused of. And if we weren't willing to tell the stories, we weren't going to be able to serve them in the way in which we felt was most appropriate. We also began to recognize after 30 years of serving those who were in those kinds of situations that the communities weren't understanding the way in which our criminal justice system was functioning. There wasn't the kind of transparency that was needed in order to really detail those struggles. And so we decided that we needed to reach the community and begin a more honest conversation about how race and class were impacting our criminal justice system and its outcomes. So we launched the Race and Poverty Initiative that then grew into the Community Remembrance Project. And that project was really spearheaded around the fact that when we were deciding to have more honest conversations about race and class, we really found that to do restorative truth-telling work meant that we really actually had to look further back in our past. We had to begin to unearth and talk about histories and legacy of the era of enslavement. That the enduring injustices of that time period wasn't just that there was involuntary servitude, but that an entire narrative was created. So stories of racial hierarchy and racial difference, mythologies of white supremacy versus black inferiority that didn't just inform an era, but allowed for institutions and society to construct itself in such a way that black people in that time period were not even considered fully human. And if we were to be honest about why, after that enduring time period, we saw more violence following the end of the Civil War, that it wasn't just that it was an end of chattel slavery, but there was an introduction of mass violence and massacres during a time period when we were meant to reconstruct our nation. And then even after that, when unfortunately our federal government abandoned the Reconstruction time period, and we entered into 7 decades of racial terrorism, during which time period Benjamin Hance was killed, we yet were in a time period where we still hadn't dismantled the narratives. We still hadn't done the difficult work of understanding why we were not willing to uphold equal justice under the law. And we would argue that even though we have come a long way today, we're still struggling with questions of equal justice under the law. We're still wrestling with difficult time periods that we haven't recovered from as a nation. And if we are to have repair, we have to begin with truth-telling. So the Community Remembrance Project was not necessarily EJI saying that we were going to go in communities and do the difficult work of truth-telling, but we were asking communities whether they would do that for themselves. Would they find in themselves the willingness to tell difficult stories, to talk about histories that had long gone with silence surrounding them? So many times when we travel to communities for dedications and ceremonies, very often people will come and say, I just had no idea. I just had no idea. I didn't know this happened here. And if you just have no idea of some of the deep-rooted injustices and harms that shaped a community, then how do you know how to resolve the legacies of those harms? What we are interested in is the resolving of the harm. We do believe that that's possible, but we believe that that requires effort, that it's intentional, that it's not going to happen inevitably just because we hope it will, but that there has to be a process through which we go through. There have been so many wonderful remarks here, and we've heard different parts of the story of the remembrance of Benjamin Hance, including the pardons from the governor. But what we recognize about the 6,500 victims of racial terror lynching in our nation is that those lynchings were not about justice. They weren't even about culpability. You didn't have to be accused of a crime to be a victim of lynching in our nation. You could have been participating in political activity. You could have been resisting economic exploitation. You could have been self-defending your family from being attacked. And these were the circumstances in which we don't need a pardon per se, but we needed equal protection under the law. We needed a society that was dedicated to higher ideals of what it means to value the life of our neighbor. And we haven't resolved fully what it means to do that. But we have an opportunity when we're willing to look at a difficult history, when we're willing to remember something that has impacted our communities and say, if this was happening today, what could I do? Could I have helped resolve this situation? I was thinking of the remarks that Will Schwartz gave, which I so appreciated. I was just thinking about those 375 votes. Was anyone else floored by that? 375 votes to shift a state out of chattel slavery. 375 votes means that we're here today. We all have a part to play. Our voices are very important. And the willingness to be present and to show up and to be in a space means more, even if it looks small. And one of the things that we have to reckon with is that when we think even about Mr. Hance's story, and we've heard about the doctor twice now who asked the mob to just move on because his wife was in a situation. When we think about that story, we have to ask ourselves, how is he remembered today? Maybe at that time, in that moment, maybe there was something for him that just felt like, this is a terrible situation, but I just need to protect me and mine. But when we remember the story today, what does that experience mean for us? How do we remember him compared to the 375? And how do we want to be remembered in our lifetime? What legacy do we want to leave? How will we continue to shape our communities in ways that we hope to enforce and help see equal protection under the law? That we even hope to do the difficult work of trying to love our neighbors as ourselves? I'll just end with these thoughts because they've mattered to me personally. But when we were reading the scripture reading about Jesus and his passion, and he was going to the cross, before he did that, he said, Greater love has no one than this, but to lay their lives down for their friend, to lay their life down. And many people associate Jesus saying that with him going to the cross and making that final sacrifice. But the reality is, if you believe what the Gospels teach, he did that before he died. He left the comforts of heaven and came. He laid his life down. Then, the realities of supreme justice, of supreme comfort. But he decided that there was something more important to him, to his Father. There was something valuable about humanity and about creation and about true justice that required a willing sacrifice, which he made. And if we ourselves are to wonder what love has to look like, love is involved in justice. That's why racial terrorism and racial terror lynching can never be associated with a form of vigilante justice, which it is sometimes termed. Injustice involves hatred. It involves the lack of care for our neighbor. Justice is the opposite. It requires love to function properly. And if we are to truly do that difficult work, there may be some things about our own lives, comforts that we have to lay down to love our neighbors. But if we're willing to do that difficult work, we'll actually find that we find more in the care of one another than we do in the self-deflection and self-protection that keeps us apart. So from the Equal Justice Initiative, we're so grateful for all of you coming and being a part of your own community's remembrance, your own community's healing, and your own community's process. We're so grateful that we've been able to support that work in even a small way of this historical marker, but we trust that this work will continue, and we hope that any legacies of injustices that this community continues to face will be approached with a heart of courage and a heart of understanding that if you're willing, change can happen. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Gabrielle. Assisting the dignitaries today in the unveiling of the marker are some very special guests. Jeremiah Jordan was a well-respected African-American businessman here in Leonardtown in the late 19th century. He ran a hotel and livery stable and held the contract to supply horses to the United States Postal Service. When members of the Benjamin Hance lynch mob were brought to trial, Mr. Jordan was among those chosen to serve on the jury. A unanimous decision could not be reached, so the members of the mob were neither convicted nor acquitted. Sometimes later, Mr. Jordan's business was burned to the ground by arsonists and resulted in a total loss. And we welcome his descendant today, Mr. Spears. In the 20th century, Sheriff Joe Lee Somerville, during his tenure as the first African-American sheriff in Maryland, and only the 6th in the nation, was himself a victim of racial terrorism as he faced effigies hanging from the trees and other horrors as he answered patrol calls. Not one to be intimidated, Sheriff Somerville served the department for 5 years as sheriff, retiring in 1982. And we welcome his family members today. And I'd ask yeah, you're right. I would ask Mr. Spears and the representatives of the Somerville family to join Sheriff Cameron and Commissioner President Guy at the marker. Whenever you're ready, gentlemen. The marker is two-sided with the lynching statement on this side about all of America, and Benjamin Hance's story is on the other side.
Lord our God, Any violation of due process urges us to appeal once again in a nonviolent way for an end to racism, for equal justice under the law, so that peace and reconciliation may reign. The work of justice will be peace, says the prophet Isaiah. How often do we celebrate this big little town as a beautiful and blessed place to live and raise a family, a pleasant garden. Yet this occasion of remembering an abuse of justice 134 years ago should disabuse us of any notion that our Garden of Eden is untouched by sin. We withhold condemnation from anyone except for injustice itself. We experience a sense of sadness that we have not had the courage to stand up for truth and justice on behalf of many. Through our gathering this afternoon, we consecrate this memorial by our remembering of a grievous wrong that was committed against justice and due process. Lord, repair our country and community and heal us of the sins of racism and injustice. Let justice descend, you heavens, like dew from above. Like gentle rain, let the clouds drop it down. Again, says the prophet Isaiah. In return, may peace and reconciliation abound as we look beyond the veil of race and ethnic background and see each other as brothers and sisters in Christ, the one who lives and reigns with you, O God, forever and ever. And let us say amen.